The truck was 22 years old, and it showed every one of them. The left rear panel had been scraped at some point and never repainted, leaving a streak of bare metal that had gone the color of old blood in the October cold. The heater worked on the driver's side only if you held the vent open with a folded matchbook, which Ruth Calloway had been doing for 3 winters running because the repair Frank had always meant to make had stayed unmade after Frank stopped being around to make things right. She had not replaced the matchbook. She understood in a quiet corner of herself she did not examine too directly exactly why she had not replaced it. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night in the second week of October, and Ruth was driving home from a 12-hour shift at Millhaven Community Clinic, where she volunteered 3 days a week doing intake assessments and wound care and the kind of general-purpose emergency medicine that the town's only remaining physician, a 29-year-old resident on loan from a Columbus hospital network, did not yet have the confidence to handle alone. Ruth had retired from nursing 6 years ago. The retirement had lasted approximately 4 months before the clinic called, and she had driven over in the same truck on a Wednesday afternoon and sat down in the waiting room and gotten back to work. She was 72 years old. She had the hands of a woman who had spent 35 years in emergency medicine and the posture of someone who had learned early that the body follows the spine rather than the other way around. She drove with both hands on the wheel, out of a habit formed over decades of roads like Route 9 through the Ridge Country, where ice formed in the low spots in November, and deer came out of the dark tree lines without warning, and wet leaves on asphalt in October could take a front tire sideways before a driver had time to correct. She knew Route 9 the way she knew the bones of a hand, 6,000 times in the dark easy. She knew where the road dipped beneath the old Millbridge overpass, where the lanes narrowed to 1.5 between the concrete abutments and the guardrail, had been struck and straightened and struck again by 30 years of trucks misjudging the approach. She knew the smell of the creek below that bridge in different seasons. She knew the way the road noise bounced off the underside of the concrete span and came back from two directions at once, which always made the radio go strange for about 4 seconds. And she had always liked those 4 seconds because they reminded her that the world was full of ordinary phenomena that were also, if you paid attention, quietly remarkable. She was a quarter mile out from the overpass when she saw the lights. Not headlights, work lights. The portable halogen kind that construction crews set up for night paving or bridge inspection, white, blue, and very bright, mounted on stands. 3 of them positioned on the far side of the bridge, angled in a configuration that made no sense for roadwork, because roadwork lit the road itself, and these lights were aimed at the approach at the narrow gap where the lanes squeezed between the abutments, illuminating anyone coming through the bridge from the east in the way that a lamp illuminates a target on a shooting range. Ruth slowed. She had been a nurse for 35 years, and before that she had grown up on a farm in Guernsey County where her father ran cattle, and her grandfather had operated a still in the back of the equipment shed with the calm, methodical approach of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between a useful product and a fire. She had a particular and well-developed talent for recognizing when a thing was not what it appeared to be. Roadwork lights aimed at an approach were not roadwork. She pulled onto the gravel shoulder 150 yards east of the bridge and cut her headlights. She left the engine running because the heater on the driver's side was the only warmth available, and the October night was in the low 40s, and she was wearing her clinic jacket, which was canvas and not particularly warm, and she was going to be outside in a moment, and she wanted to be thinking clearly when she was. With the headlights off and her eyes adjusting, the work lights under the bridge became more distinct. She could see movement. 4 figures at minimum on the approach side, positioned at intervals along the concrete abutment and in the shadows behind the guardrail. She could see the dark line of something strung across the road at ankle height, 2 strands of it, the second set about 20 feet back from the first. The kind of thing designed to bring down a vehicle at speed. The kind of thing that was not an accident and was not maintenance and was not anything with a legitimate reason to be on a county road at midnight. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and thought about who drove this road at this hour on a Tuesday in October. Then she heard them. The sound came from behind her, from the east, still half a mile back at least, but building with the particular layered resonance of multiple engines on a cold night, each one separate and yet part of something larger, a chord rather than a single note. She had heard that sound before. 22 years in Millhaven County. You heard it at the Iron Cross Rally every September and at the Memorial Ride in May, and sometimes just traveling between townships when a chapter was moving together on the two lanes. She had learned the way county residents learn these things over time, what the sound meant and what it did not mean. She had a reasonable and evidence-based opinion of what it did not mean. Ruth Calloway opened her door and stepped out into the October cold. She walked to the center of Route 9 and stood there. She was 5'4" in the flat-soled work shoes she wore to the clinic. She weighed 138 pounds. She was wearing the blue canvas jacket with the clinic's name embroidered on the left chest that she kept forgetting to leave in her locker at the end of shifts. She stood in the middle of the county road in the dark, and she raised both arms. The lead motorcycle came around the long curve at approximately 40 miles an hour, and its headlights swept across her and the brakes engaged with a sound that she felt in her back teeth. The front tire stopped 6 feet from her shoes. Ruth did not step back. She had held the hands of people dying from things that could have been prevented. She had stood in hospital corridors at 2 in the morning, delivering information that broke the world apart for the families receiving it. And she had learned in the first year of her nursing career that if you step back, people read it as uncertainty. And uncertainty was the last thing anyone needed from the person who knew what was actually happening. She walked toward the motorcycle. The man on it was large in the way that suggested structure rather than accumulation built into the frame rather than added to it. He had the particular stillness of someone whose reflexes had been calibrated in situations that would unravel most people and who was currently waiting with controlled patience to understand what kind of situation this was. His cut was dark leather with a chapter patch she could read in the combined glow of his headlight and the distant work lights under the bridge steel pennants MC. Below it, a second patch president. He pulled his helmet off. Cole Mercer was 48 years old with a face that had been through weather and decisions and the specific physical record of a man who had ridden hard roads for a quarter century. A scar ran from below his left ear to the jawline, an old one healed smooth and pale. His eyes were gray, and they were doing the thing that eyes do when the brain behind them is processing a compressed timeline very quickly. He looked at her. He looked at the bridge 200 yards ahead. He looked at her again. Ruth said, "There are men under that bridge, and they are not there for any legitimate reason. I counted at least 6 on the approach side, and I cannot see the far side from here. They have work lights positioned to blind your approach, and there is wire strung across the road under the span. 2 strands, first one at ankle height, second approximately 20 feet behind it. At road speed in the dark, the first wire takes down your lead bike. The second catches whoever manages to brake in time." Cole Mercer said nothing for exactly 1 full second. Then he said, "Get off the road." He said it the way people say things when they are accustomed to being understood the first time. And Ruth, who had 35 years of experience identifying which voice in a room was actually in charge, stepped onto the gravel shoulder without argument. Behind the lead bike, the column was stopping in a ragged cascade of brake lights. 14 machines visible from where Ruth stood before the road curved away into the dark, and she knew from the sound that there were more behind them. The engines dropped from travel speed to idle in a sequence that moved back down the line like a wave returning from a shore, and then the column was still. A second man came forward from the bike directly behind Cole's. He was built differently from Cole, wider through the chest and shoulders, with a full red-brown beard that had grown long enough to be tucked partway into his cut. His face had been broken and set and broken again, and had eventually arrived at an expression of permanent considered assessment. His patch read Vice President. The name below it, Garrett Boone. Boone looked at the bridge. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Cole with a single questioning tilt of his chin. Cole said, "She stopped us, says there's a setup under the bridge." Boone was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Those lights are positioned wrong for road work." "Yes, they are," Ruth said. Boone looked at her more carefully. She recognized the recalibration. She had seen it enough times in enough different contexts to recognize it immediately and not take it personally. It was the adjustment of assumption that happens when someone encounters a 72-year-old woman in a clinic jacket and discovers that she has a specific and unblinking competence. Cole had dismounted. Standing next to her, he was a full foot taller, and she noted, as she always noted with large men in close proximity, the way he occupied space without pressing into hers. There was training in that, or instinct refined by training, and she filed it as information about the kind of person she was dealing with. "How close did you get to the bridge?" he asked. "150 yards on foot after I pulled off the road." She described what she had seen: the angle of the lights, the positioning of the figures along the abutment, the wire across the road. She described it in the precise, economical way she had learned to present patient information in emergency rooms over 3 decades. No editorializing, no hedging specific, observable facts in the order she had observed them. Cole listened without interrupting. A lot of people interrupted when receiving information they needed, filling the space reflexively, the way a student fills silence when nervous. Cole Mercer did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "You drove in from the east. Did you see any vehicles parked on the ridge above the bridge or on the service road behind the north abutment?" Ruth thought back through the drive. Two trucks on the service road. One had a generator in the bed. The other was a panel van with no markings on either side. Cole looked at Boone. Something passed between them that required no words. Boone walked back toward the column. Cole said, "Stay behind the last bike in the column. Understood?" "Understood." She paused. "Do you have anyone with medical training in your group?" He blinked minimally. "One of my men was a combat medic." "Why?" "Because whatever is strung across that road is designed to bring down a motorcycle at speed," Ruth said. "If anyone goes down on that approach, they will be seriously hurt in a location where standard emergency services will take 20 minutes to reach. I have a kit in my truck. It is a good kit. 35 years in emergency medicine. That is a credential, not a boast. I can be useful to you tonight in a specific way." Cole Mercer looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes and the old scar, and the expression of a man who has been recalculating something he thought he had already fully calculated. "Your name," he said. "Ruth Calloway." He put his hand out. She shook it. His grip was exactly what she had assessed it would be from the hands themselves. Careful. Not performing. "Cole Mercer," he said. "Get your kit and stay back until I call for you." She went and got her kit from behind the passenger seat of the truck. It was a serious kit, not a commercial first aid package, but a custom-assembled trauma bag she had built herself over 20 years, adding and subtracting based on the calls she ran and the gaps she found, the kind of kit that a person builds when they have been in enough situations where the right tool was not available and have decided that particular problem will not repeat itself. What happened over the next 45 minutes, Ruth would later describe to her sister as organized and purposeful, in the way that controlled demolition is organized and purposeful, extremely deliberate specific force applied to a specific structure, and the result being a very large thing coming apart in a controlled and efficient manner. Cole sent 4 men on foot up the ridge trail to the limestone shelf above the bridge span, a vantage point that Ruth had not known existed because it was not the kind of geography you learn from a road, but from watching the road from above. A former Army Ranger named Sawyer led them. He had the wiry, economical, physical presence of a man whose body had been refined over years of being asked to do difficult things quietly in darkness. Cole sent Boone and 2 others down the drainage channel on the bridge's north side, moving through the dark below the road grade, where the work lights on the far side of the bridge would not reach. Ruth watched Boone disappear into the dark without comment. She had watched people go toward difficult things for 35 years. She positioned herself at the tailgate of her truck with the kit open on the flat metal surface, and she waited. The first sound from under the bridge came at 12:19. Not a gunshot. A short, contained impact, the kind of sound that happens when significant force meets a hard surface very quickly. Then another. Then for approximately 30 minutes, a sequence of sounds that Ruth filed under her medical training. She was here to treat, not to narrate. They brought Sawyer to her at 12:42. He had taken a rifle stock to the left shoulder and collarbone during the takedown of a ridge sentry who had reacted faster than anticipated and gotten one good swing before Sawyer put him down. The collarbone was not fractured, Ruth determined in 2 minutes of careful palpation by headlamp. It was badly bruised, and the shoulder joint had been partially dislocated and had resocketed imperfectly, which was not uncommon in the field and was correctable. She had Sawyer lie on the tailgate. He was approximately 30 years old, and he had the pain tolerance of someone who had operated in situations where stopping was not an option. He lay still while she worked and made no sound, which told her both about his pain threshold and about his training. She reduced the shoulder fully in 4 minutes. She splinted it and gave him the prognosis in plain language, what had happened, what she had done, what recovery looked like, what to watch for. Sawyer looked at her from the tailgate. He said, "That hurt." "Yes," Ruth said. "It was supposed to hurt less than the alternative. You should have it imaged in the morning. No load-bearing use of that arm for 2 to 3 weeks minimum." "Yes, ma'am." Cole appeared at the edge of the tailgate light. He was unhurt as far as she could assess. He had the quality of a man who has been through something significant and has processed it into a usable format while it was still happening. He looked at Sawyer. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the kit laid out on the tailgate in the ordered sequence of its use. 14 of them, he said. All secured. Nobody on our side with serious injuries. Good. Send me anyone with cuts or contusions. I want to look at them properly. 4 of their men need attention. Send them too. She worked for another 25 minutes. 2 lacerations on chapter members, one from a fall on the bridge's concrete edge, one from a wire that had caught a forearm before the angle was cleared. She cleaned and closed both properly and assessed for deeper damage. Then she treated 3 of the secured men from the ambush team, 2 with contusions and 1 with a wrist she suspected was fractured. She treated all of them with the same attention. Injured was injured. The reasons for being injured did not change what the injury required. The man Cole brought to her last was different from the others. He was not injured. He was sitting on the rear bumper of one of the panel vans that Boone's men had driven out from behind the north abutment, and he had zip-tied wrists and the extensively rearranged face of a man who had been on the wrong side of the last 40 minutes. He was in his mid-30s, lean with a quality of professional competence that had been substantially reduced over the course of the evening. A tactical vest, expensive gear, the kind that cost money and planning. This was not a group of local men making a local decision. Cole crouched in front of him. "You want to have this conversation now, or you want to sit here until morning?" The man looked at the column of steel pennants MC arranged along Route 9 in the dark. He counted what was visible of them and did some arithmetic. He said a name, Harlan Briggs. Ruth's hand stopped moving. She was resealing the outer pocket of the kit. Her hand stopped on the Velcro, and she was aware of the stopping, and she made herself complete the motion, pressing the Velcro flat, pressing it once more. Her hands remained steady. They stayed steady. Harlan Briggs. She knew that name the way you know the name of a place where something terrible happened. It lives in a specific address in the mind, stored not with ordinary information, but with the weight of things that have changed the shape of everything that came after. Cole was talking to the man, his voice low and even, and Ruth was not listening to the specifics of what was being said because she was standing at her tailgate with both hands on the kit, and she was thinking about Frank. Frank Calloway had been a paramedic for 23 years. He had worked the eastern Ohio corridor out of Millhaven Station 4, covering 3 townships and a stretch of industrial corridor that included 3 chemical processing facilities, one of which was Briggs Industrial Waste. Frank had been meticulous about documentation in the way that certain people are meticulous about the thing that matters most to them. Not because anyone required it, but because he believed that what was not written down did not fully count as having happened. He had come home one evening in the spring, 3 years before he died, with a specific look on his face. Not upset exactly, more like a man who has walked into a room and found the furniture arranged in a way that tells him something important about the person who arranged it. He had said, "I think there is something wrong at the Briggs plant." He had said it carefully, the way Frank said things when he was certain enough to speak, but not yet certain enough to speak at full volume. Ruth had asked what he meant. He had talked about patterns. He had been responding to medical emergencies in the zone downhill of the Briggs facility for years, and he had been, without fully realizing it, tracking something. A cluster of respiratory presentations in the neighborhoods below the eastern drainage creek. An elevated rate of specific neurological symptoms in children under 10 living within a mile radius. A pattern of complaints that individually looked like ordinary illness and collectively looked like something with a source. He had taken his findings to the county health office. The county health office had been extremely courteous and had done nothing. He had returned twice more. Courteous, nothing. He had begun keeping more detailed records. He had bought an engineering journal from the office supply store, the kind with the hard cover and graph paper pages, because he liked the precision that graph paper allowed for his notations. She had seen him working in it at the kitchen table in the evenings, cross-referencing call logs, plotting incident locations on hand-drawn maps, pulling regulatory filings from the county's public record system, and annotating them in his careful small handwriting. He had died of pulmonary fibrosis 16 months after that first kitchen conversation. The official diagnosis said idiopathic, which meant of unknown cause, which meant the physicians in a position to say the actual cause were not in a position to say the actual cause. The doctor who delivered the diagnosis had been a kind man. He had said that idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis could affect anyone and that there was no established source. He had said it in a way that Ruth, 35 years in emergency medicine, heard, as there is a source, and I am telling you what I am authorized to tell you. She had cried twice after Frank died. Once the night of, and once 6 weeks later when she found the journal in the drawer of his workshop where he kept the things he was still working on. She had not cried since. She had not opened the journal since. It was in the glove box of this truck, where she had put it the morning she decided to take it to the county health office, and then had not taken it to the county health office, because she could not determine what good it would do against a man with Harlan Briggs's resources. She had been carrying it for 3 years. Cole stood up from his crouch beside the secured man. He walked to Ruth's tailgate. He moved with the unhurried directness of a man who has learned that the pace you set determines the tone of what follows. He said, "The man who sent the ambush team tonight, Harlan Briggs, you know that name." It was not a question. He had been watching her face. Ruth turned and opened the glove box of her truck. The journal was there. It had always been there. Thick 120 pages of graph paper covered front to back in Frank's small, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a man who measured things for a living. She took it out and held it for a moment with both hands, feeling the weight of it, the particular weight of a thing that has been waiting for the right moment. She handed it to Cole. "My husband was a paramedic," she said. "He worked this corridor for 23 years. He found something wrong at the Briggs plant 3 years before he died, and he documented it the way a trained hazmat responder documents things, carefully and completely." Cole looked at the cover. He opened it to the first page, read for a moment, turned 3 pages, stopped. His jaw tightened in the specific way of a man processing information that confirms something he already knew was true and finding the confirmation worse rather than better. He looked at her. "How long have you had this?" 3 years. He held her gaze without judgment. There were people who would have asked why she had not acted sooner, and that was a fair question, but it was a question that required understanding that carrying something and knowing what to do with it are not the same problem. Cole Mercer did not ask it. He said, "Briggs has been dumping. We found the first barrel on the Ridge Trail 2 months ago. Since then, we have found 11 more. We did not yet know whose they were. Tonight we were supposed to stop existing before we found out." He paused. "Your husband documented the source." "There is more," Ruth said. She had spent the last 20 minutes while her hands worked on lacerations running the differential, the way she ran differentials in the emergency room. Systematic, factual, following the evidence to the conclusion it pointed to. The county health office has been compromised, not loudly, in the way that looks like bureaucratic delay until you realize the delay always runs in one direction. Briggs has a connection to the county commissioner's office. His daughter married Briggs's operations director 3 years ago. The connection started 6 months after Frank's first formal complaint. Cole was quiet. Behind him, the chapter moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before, securing the panel vans, collecting equipment, working without needing to be directed. Drift, the compact, methodical man who handled the chapter's documentation, was moving between the barrels with a phone and evidence bags. Cole said, "The barrel's on the ridge. Where does that drainage run?" "South drainage feeds Miller's Creek," Ruth said. "Miller's Creek connects to the main water table for the lower townships. Municipal intake is 2 miles downstream. She paused. Millhaven Elementary School is on that water line. Something settled in Cole Mercer's face that moved past operational into a zone that was quieter and colder and considerably more purposeful. He said, "I want to show you something." He led her along the service road behind the north abutment, moving carefully with a flashlight to a place behind the bridge where the creek bank had been recently disturbed. She could see it in the beam ground, compressed and scraped vegetation cleared in a roughly rectangular pattern, the kind of clearing that happens when men work quickly at night moving heavy things. He took her to the back of one of the panel vans and opened the rear doors. 6 barrels. Industrial HDPE plastic, black sealed with locking rings, each one stenciled with the diamond-shaped hazmat marker she had seen on emergency call sheets for 35 years. Class 6, acute oral toxicity, the serious category. The category that with chronic low-level exposure through contaminated water produced the specific progressive internal damage that looked on an official death certificate exactly like idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Ruth stood in front of those barrels for a moment with the flashlight beam steady because Cole was holding it and his hands were steady and hers were steady too. They were always steady. It was the one thing about her hands she could count on in any situation. She thought about Frank sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with his graph paper journal and his measured voice saying, "I think there is something wrong at the Briggs plant." She thought about the 3 years, the journal in the glove box, the county health office visits that went nowhere, the direct line to the EPA field office contact she had programmed into her phone and never called because she could not determine what good it would do. She turned away from the barrels. She walked back to her truck. She stood with her hand on the door and her forehead against the cold metal of the roof for a moment. She did not cry. She had not cried since the workshop drawer 3 years ago. She was not going to cry now. What she was going to do was the thing she had been unable until this specific night to find the way to do. Cole came up behind her. He stood at a respectful distance and waited. That was something she had already noted about him. He understood when a person needed a moment, and he did not fill that moment with words. She turned around. "Those barrels need to be documented before anything moves," she said. "Photographed, sampled, serial numbers recorded. The dump site behind the abutment the same. Chain of custody from the first photograph, or a defense attorney will find a way to make it all disappear." Cole said one word: drift. The compact man appeared immediately from the darkness, which meant he had been nearby the entire time. He had a phone in his hand and 3 sealed evidence bags. "Full documentation," Cole said. "Serial numbers, seal condition, every measurement. Soil samples from the base of each barrel and from the drainage channel. Sealed and labeled." Drift was already moving. Cole turned back to Ruth. "My people have contacts at the EPA field office in Columbus. I can have someone on the phone within the hour." Ruth reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card that had been there for 3 years, slightly worn at the corners. "I have the direct line for the Ohio EPA Emergency Response District Chief. He was Frank's supervisor before he moved to the EPA. He has been waiting for something he could use against Briggs for 18 months. Cole took the card. He looked at it. He looked at her face. There was a moment between them that required no words. Then Cole Mercer said, "Mrs. Calloway." "Ruth, Ruth." He looked at the journal in his other hand, then back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Something with depth and age behind it, not quite grief and not quite recognition, but occupying the space where both of those live. "Your husband's name, Frank Calloway." "Yes." Cole was quiet for a moment. He opened the journal to the first page where Frank had written his name in the clean, exact way he wrote everything: Frank Allen Calloway, the date. And below it the word documentation in the careful capitals of a man who understood what the word required. When Cole spoke again, his voice was different. Not softer exactly, more deliberate. The way a person handles something they have just discovered is fragile in a way they did not previously know. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to understand that I did not know who you were when you stepped in front of my bike tonight." Ruth looked at him. She had been reading people for 35 years, reading them in the high-stakes way that emergency medicine required, and she read something in Cole Mercer's face now that she had not seen there before. Not the operational steadiness, not the authority. Something older than either of those. Something with real weight. 22 years ago, Cole said. Route 9, about 4 miles east of here. November. I went off the road on a patch of black ice, hit the guardrail, and went over into the drainage ditch on the south side. I had 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a head injury I did not yet fully understand. I was 26 years old, and I was alone, and I was hurt badly enough that I was not going to be able to help myself out of what I had landed in. He paused. A paramedic came, Millhaven Station 4. He came down the embankment to me instead of waiting at the road. He stayed with me for 45 minutes until the second unit arrived. The protocol was stabilize and wait. He did not follow the protocol. He stayed and he talked to me the entire time, keeping me present, keeping me from going under. He talked about ordinary things. His wife, who was a nurse, a patient he'd had that week who had done something funny, a dog they were considering getting but had not yet decided on. Ruth's chest did something complicated. I never got his full name, Cole said. The report I found afterward just said Millhaven Station 4. I tried to find him when I was back on my feet. The station said he was on medical leave, and then when I called again, there was no information available. He held the journal between them, not returning it, just holding it. Frank Allen Calloway, Millhaven Station 4. The October night was cold and quiet. Downstream, the creek moved south toward the town, carrying what it carried the way it had been carrying it for years. The chapter stood beside their bikes with the patience of men who understood that something was happening that required the particular respect of distance and silence. Ruth Calloway put her hand on the journal. Cole did not release it immediately. They held it between them for a moment, this record of a man who had been both of theirs in different ways, who had stayed on a cold road for 45 minutes, because the protocol said wait, and the man in front of him needed more than wait, who had sat at his kitchen table with graph paper and careful handwriting, because the world needed someone to write the things down accurately even when it cost something to do it. Cole released the journal. She held it alone. She stood with it in both hands in the dark above the contaminated creek, and she let the October cold be what it was, and she let the moment be what it was without trying to manage it into something more comfortable. She had learned long ago that the moments you try to manage become the moments that stay unprocessed. Better to let them be fully themselves. She put the journal under her arm. She looked at Cole Mercer, who had been 26 years old in a drainage ditch on a cold road and had been kept present by the quiet, even voice of a man who believed that what was not written down did not count as having happened, and who was now 48 years old, standing in the dark with 43 men behind him, in the specific cold rage of a person who has found a purpose. She said, "What do you need from me?" Cole said, "Everything you know about Harlan Briggs, and everything Frank documented, all of it, and I need you to be the chain of custody holder on that journal from this moment forward. It needs to go to the right people in the right hands." "I know the right people," Ruth said. "I have known them for 3 years." She took out her phone. She found the contact she had entered 3 years ago and never called. Ray Decker, Ohio EPA Emergency Response District Chief. She looked at the name on the screen for a moment. Then she called. 2 rings. A man answered his voice carrying the particular wakefulness of someone who had trained himself to come fully alert at a phone call in the night because his job sometimes required it. She said, "Ray, it's Ruth Calloway, Frank's wife." She paused. "I have what you have been waiting for. I need you awake and ready to move. This is going to happen fast." A brief silence, then Ray Decker said, "How fast?" Ruth looked at the column of steel pennants MC stretched along Route 9 engines idling headlights, beginning to come on one by one in the October dark. "Tonight fast," she said. Cole had already called the chapter emergency muster. The regional cascade went out at 12:31. The steel pennants chapter ran 43 members. Affiliated chapters within radio range added another 60. The broader regional network reached by the cascade added 40 more. By 1 in the morning, a column of 143 machines was forming on the county roads east of Millhaven, and it was heading west. But before the column moved toward the Briggs compound on the East Ridge, there was something else. The man from the bridge, the one with the tactical vest and the professional bearing, and the name Harlan Briggs on his lips, had said something else before Cole stood up from his crouch. He had said it because he was calculating the difference between what cooperation offered and what silence cost, and he had arrived at the calculation quickly once he had seen the size of the chapter assembled on Route 9. He had said secondary item. He had said Briggs wanted two things done tonight. The first was the bridge. The second was securing anyone connected to the documentation. He had said the word Jake. Ruth's hands went still. She said the name back, Jake. The man said a boy, Miller Road. Briggs's people went for him 2 hours ago. Cole looked at Ruth. She said, my nephew, Jake Calloway. He is 16 years old. He lives on Miller Road 7 miles from here with my sister Carol. She paused. She said the next part steadily because it needed to be said steadily. I told Jake too much about Frank's papers several months ago. I was not as careful as I should have been. I thought it was safe to speak plainly to family. Cole said Boone. Boone was already at his shoulder. He said 18 minutes at road speed. Cole said full chapter, now. The engines came up from idle to travel in a single collective surge, the sound of it filling the county road and the ridge above it, and the October dark beyond 143 machines in formation. Headlights on moving north and west through the Ohio countryside toward a farmhouse on Miller Road, where a 16-year-old boy had been taken because he was connected to documentation that a powerful man needed to make disappear. Ruth got in her truck. She drove with both hands on the wheel and Frank's journal on the passenger seat, and the heater vent held open with the matchbook on the driver's side, and the column of steel pennants MC filling her windshield with light and sound, and the particular organized velocity of a large group of people moving toward a thing that needed correcting before it became irreversible. She called Carol from the truck. The phone rang 9 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called a 3rd time, and on the 4th ring, Carol answered with a voice that had the specific quality of a person who has been awake for some time and has been trying to be calm about it and has not been successful. Ruth said, I am coming. 17 minutes. Do not do anything to make the situation change before I get there. Carol said in a voice barely above a whisper, there is a man in the kitchen. Ruth said, I know. I know about the man. Do not give him a reason. Carol said, Jake is here. He has not been hurt. Ruth said, good. Keep it that way. 17 minutes. She drove. Miller Road was a 2-lane county road that ran between a soybean field on the west and a stand of second-growth oak on the east, and at 1 in the morning, it was exactly as dark as rural Ohio roads are at 1 in the morning. The farmhouse at 4417 Miller Road had lights on in 2 windows, ground floor front, room and kitchen. Ruth knew this house the way she knew the bones of her own hands. She had been coming here for 30 years since before Jake was born, since Carol married Dale Marsh and they bought the property and began the slow decades-long project of making it what they wanted it to be. The van in the driveway was not Carol's minivan. It was a panel van, dark, no markings, identical to the vans from the bridge. Cole was at her window before the engine was off. He said, stay here until I signal. Ruth opened the door and got out. She looked at him across the roof. Cole said, this is not a good idea. She said, my sister is in that farmhouse, and I know the layout of that house in total darkness, because I have been moving through it for 30 years. I know my sister's voice and my nephew's voice, and I know how a frightened person inside that house will react to the sound of 43 motorcycles arriving in the driveway. You don't have that. She paused. I go in first, alone. Your people hold on the road until I signal. Cole looked at Boone. Boone looked at the house and then at Ruth. Boone said she goes in first. We hold. Ruth walked up the driveway. She stepped over the loose board on the 3rd porch step by memory. The front door was unlocked as it always was, because Carol had always said the county was safe enough, and Dale had said the same less frequently toward the end, and not at all in the last 4 years. Ruth turned the handle and went in without knocking. The front room was empty. The kitchen light was on. She could smell coffee and the particular yeasty sweetness of fresh biscuits, which meant Carol had been baking since she couldn't sleep, which was what Carol did when she couldn't sleep, and had been doing since they were girls in Guernsey County. She walked down the hall. She turned the corner into the kitchen. Carol was at the table with both hands around a mug and the specific look of someone who has been holding very still for a long time and is not sure how much longer she can hold it. She was 68 years old, with Ruth's bone structure and 20 fewer pounds, and the expression of a woman who has learned over a lifetime to manage fear without showing it and is presently at the limit of that management. A man stood against the far wall near the mudroom door. He was in his mid-30s, not large, but with the bearing of someone who considered himself capable. A holster on his hip, his right hand near it, but not on it, the posture of someone maintaining a controlled situation who does not want to escalate unless the situation requires it. Jake was at the kitchen table across from Carol. He was 16 years old and tall in the way of a boy who has grown into his height faster than his weight could follow. He had his father's coloring, sandy hair, and light eyes, and those eyes were doing something that Ruth noted and filed. They were frightened, and they knew it, and they were not pretending otherwise, and they were still holding steady. That was not nothing. When Ruth walked in, Carol and Jake both did the things she had hoped they would do. The relief that crossed their faces was real and complete before they could moderate it, and the man against the wall read it correctly. His hand moved closer to his hip. Ruth said, "I'm her sister." She said it to the man directly with the tone she used with patients who were frightened and doing things out of fright, the tone that said, "I am giving you a simple true fact. There is no concealment in it. We can all take a breath here." The man looked at her. He was calculating. She recognized the calculation. She said, "The men who were sent to the bridge tonight are not coming. Whatever you were told about how the night was supposed to go, the night did not go that way." She paused. "You have about 30 seconds to make a decision about how the next part of tonight goes for you personally." The man's jaw set. Then the sound reached the kitchen. From the front of the house, from the driveway, from the road beyond. Not aggressive, not revving, not the sound of approach. The low, patient idle of a large number of engines present and completely unhurried. The specific sound that many machines make when they are parked and running and going nowhere, which is a different sound from machines in motion. It is the sound of waiting. And waiting has its own particular quality that is different from all other sounds. The man listened to that sound. He looked at Ruth. He took his hand away from the holster slowly and placed both hands flat on the kitchen counter and stood still. Ruth said, "Thank you." She meant it without irony. She walked to Jake and put her hand on his shoulder, and he let out a long breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. She looked at Carol, who looked back at her with the expression of an older, younger sister, which is the specific expression of someone who has spent their entire life watching their sibling walk toward difficult things and has learned that arguing is not useful. She said to Jake, "Go get the door." Jake went to the front door. He opened it. Cole Mercer was standing at the bottom of the porch steps with his arms folded and his chapter arrayed behind him in the October dark. Jake looked at the column of steel pennants MC in his grandmother's driveway and said quietly, "Ruth from the hall behind him, come on." She brought Cole inside. Two chapter members took the man from the kitchen wall out through the mudroom door with quiet efficiency. The man went without resistance, which was the rational decision and which Ruth respected for being the rational decision. Cole sat at Carol's kitchen table. Carol put a mug of coffee in front of him without asking, which was what Carol did for anyone who sat at her table, regardless of circumstances, because it was the kind of hospitality that was not about the circumstances, but about the fundamental belief that people at her table got something warm in their hands. Cole accepted the mug with the careful, specific gratitude of a large man receiving a small thing from a woman who did not need to offer it. Ruth stood at the counter and laid out what they had and what they needed. The EPA documentation was complete. Drift had transmitted everything: photographs, soil samples with GPS timestamps, serial numbers from the barrel stencils, the full photographic record of the dump site at the bridge abutment. Ray Decker had confirmed receipt. He had said 3 words in response: "This is enough." The journal was the center of everything. Frank's 14 months of documentation covered incident reports, compound identifications, drainage pattern analysis, and a reconstruction of the internal communications chain at Briggs Industrial that Frank had built from public regulatory filings cross-referenced against county health records. It was the work of a man who had understood that what he was building would only matter if it was unassailable, and who had accordingly made it unassailable. But there were two things Ruth had been sitting with for the last half hour that needed to be said aloud. The first, she knew Harlan Briggs's schedule the way anyone who had lived in Millhaven County for 22 years knew the schedule of a man who employed 400 people and had his name on the county fairground building and whose money was visible in the county commissioner's campaign finance filings. She knew he was on the East Ridge compound tonight. She knew that by morning, when word reached him that the bridge had failed and the man on Miller Road had not come back, he would begin moving. Money first, then evidence, then himself in that order. That was how a man like Briggs thought about priorities. The second, she had the direct number of Patricia Holman, district investigator for the Ohio Attorney General's office, who had been building a secondary file on Briggs Industrial Waste for 2 years, based on financial irregularities in the company's environmental compliance reporting. Patricia had called Ruth 14 months ago after finding Frank's name in a secondary source document. They had spoken for an hour. Patricia had been very careful. She had said without primary documentation, "My file is circumstantial, and circumstantial against a man with Briggs's legal resources is not a basis for prosecution." Ruth looked at Cole. She said primary documentation. Cole said, "Patricia Holman, call her now." Ruth was already dialing. Patricia answered on the second ring. The voice of a person who maintains a certain watchfulness, even in sleep, because the job has trained it into her. Ruth explained in 2 minutes what was in the journal and what the EPA had received. Patricia said 3 words, "Send it now." Ruth photographed the first 14 pages of the journal and sent them. 4 minutes of silence on the line. Then Patricia said, "I need one more thing. I need someone who can place Harlan Briggs as the direct authorizing source for tonight's action at the bridge." Cole put his phone on Carol's kitchen table and played the recording. Razor's voice, clear and specific, naming Harlan Briggs by full name as the source of the contract against the Steel Penance chapter leadership. Patricia listened. She said, "That is sufficient." She said, "I can have an emergency search and seizure warrant at the Briggs compound by 6 a.m. Stay reachable." She hung up. Cole looked at Boone in the doorway. Boone said, "So we wait." They waited. The chapter posted men on the road in both directions and on the ridge above the Briggs compound. Drift tracked the documentation chain as it moved through the EPA emergency response system. Sawyer, his shoulder splinted, and his arm in the sling Ruth had made from the kit, ran communications from Carol's front porch with the efficiency of a man who had run communications from considerably more difficult locations. Ruth sat at Carol's kitchen table with Carol and Jake, and the plate of biscuits Carol had baked before the evening became what it had become, and she told them what she knew. She told them about Frank's journal. She told them what Frank had found and what he had done with it, and what she believed had happened to his lungs over 6 years of running calls in the contaminated corridor below the Briggs facility. She told them because they deserved to know, and because she had been carrying it alone for 3 years, and that had been the wrong way to carry it. Carol cried. She cried the way people who rarely cry do, completely without self-consciousness. The way a container that has been full for a long time finally tips. Ruth sat with her and did not try to moderate it because grief requires the time it requires. Jake did not cry. He sat with his long frame folded in the kitchen chair and looked at the table and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Grandma always said that Dad wrote everything down because he was afraid of forgetting the things that mattered." Carol still wet, he never forgot anything. Jake, he knew it wasn't safe to forget this one. Ruth looked at her nephew. She saw the things she always looked for in people under pressure. She saw the quality of someone who, when the moment required them to be steady, discovered that they were. At 4:15, Ray Decker texted EPA team on site at the bridge. Documentation chain confirmed. Preliminary water table readings consistent with long-term contamination from Class 6 compounds. 8 years minimum based on soil stratification. This is the worst industrial contamination case in this district in 15 years. At 4:40, Patricia called. The warrant was processing. Judge had been reached at home. She said when this becomes public, which it will by morning, Frank's name will be part of the record. His documentation is the primary evidentiary chain. She paused. "How do you feel about that?" Ruth thought about it carefully. Then she said, "Frank spent 3 years building something that was supposed to be used. It was always supposed to be used." She paused. I think he would be glad. Patricia said, I think he would too. I'm sorry it took this long. Ruth said it took what it took. She said it without bitterness. The bitterness had burned out long ago. What was left was harder and cleaner than bitterness. Cole came back to the kitchen at 5:20. He said, I want to tell you something about what your husband said on Route 9. Ruth waited. He said I was 26 and I had gone off the guardrail and the drainage ditch was about 8 feet below the road grade. He came down the embankment to me. He said, I've got you, and I'm going to stay with you. And he did, for 45 minutes. He talked about ordinary things the entire time. His wife, who was a nurse, a patient that week, a dog they were thinking about getting. He said we're still deciding on the dog. His wife thinks a dog is a good idea. He thinks a dog is a good idea. They just haven't committed yet. Ruth made a sound. She pressed her hand flat against her mouth. Cole said, I figured you eventually got the dog. She said his name was Earl. He died 4 years ago. He was 12 years old. Cole said, I'm glad you got him. She said, what was the joke? Cole blinked. She said, Frank told you a joke. I can see it in your face. He had a specific joke that he told people when they needed it. Cole said it was the worst joke I have ever heard. He said it was his wife's favorite joke. He said she had told it to him at least 40 times, and he had never once laughed at it, but she laughed every time, so he kept requesting it. He said a man walks into a library and asks for books about paranoia. The librarian whispers they're right behind you. Ruth put her hand over her mouth again. Not to contain a sound, but to hold something in that was not grief and not laughter, but the specific compound of both that arrives when someone tells you something that is simultaneously painful and exactly right. She said I told him that joke the first week we were dating. Cole said he said it was the worst joke he had ever heard and that he would never stop requesting it. She took her hand away from her mouth. She looked at the October dark outside Carol's kitchen window. She said he was like that. Cole said yes, I could tell. They were quiet. The creak was audible from Carol's property moving south toward the town and the elementary school and the municipal intake and all the things that needed fixing. All the things that Frank Calloway's careful hands had been building toward through 14 months of documentation and 6 years of slow damage and a death in October and a journal in a glove box and a widow standing in the road with her arms up. At 5:58, Patricia Holman's car came up the East Ridge Road, followed by 2 unmarked state vehicles and an EPA van. She was a compact woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the look of someone who had been awake for 2 hours and had arrived precisely where she intended to arrive. She came directly to Ruth. She shook her hand with both of hers. She said, I've read the first 12 pages of the journal. It's extraordinary work. Your husband was a meticulous and courageous man. Ruth said yes, he was. She said I'd like you to walk me through the primary documentation when we're inside. You know his notation system and his cross-references better than anyone else will. Ruth said I can do that. Patricia walked to the Briggs compound gate with the warrant in her hand, 5 pages properly sealed, and pressed the intercom. A voice told her the property was private. Patricia said her name and title and the name of the Ohio Attorney General and said I have a warrant signed by Judge William Hartwell of the 6th District at 5:43 this morning, authorizing search and seizure at this address. Open the gate. The gate was quiet for a moment, then it opened. Ruth drove her truck through the gate of the Briggs compound behind Patricia's car, and the state vehicles in the EPA van and the column of steel pennants MC came behind her engines at a patient idle, filling the private road from the gate to the main house with the sound and the presence that the situation required. Harlan Briggs was in his study. He was in his evening clothes, still standing behind his desk, and he had the expression of a man who has spent his life understanding leverage and has arrived at a moment where none of the available leverage is the right kind. He looked at Patricia Holman. He looked at the investigators flanking her. He looked at Ruth Calloway in the clinic jacket holding Frank's journal in both hands. He said, I want to speak to my attorney. Patricia said, you may. While you do that, my team will begin the document seizure pursuant to the warrant. She said, Mr. Briggs, I want to be precise about what we have. We have 14 months of contemporaneous documentation by a licensed paramedic and hazmat responder detailing your company's illegal disposal of Class 6 toxic compounds in the drainage corridor east of Millhaven. We have EPA field confirmation of water table contamination consistent with that documentation going back at least 8 years. We have recorded testimony placing you personally as the authorizing source of a contract against the Steel Pennant's MC chapter leadership. And we have a 2-year financial investigation into your company's fraudulent environmental compliance reporting. She said it with the evenness of someone who has been precise about something for a long time and is now delivering it. She said your attorney will tell you the same thing I am about to tell you, which is that cooperation is your best available option. Briggs looked at the journal in Ruth's hands. He said, "Whose is that?" Ruth said, "Frank Allen Calloway, Millhaven Station 4 paramedic. My husband. He spent the last 3 years of his life documenting what you were doing to this town's water. He did it because he was the kind of man who wrote things down carefully and completely, even when it cost him something." She paused. He didn't live to see it come to this, but he built everything that brought it here. Briggs looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has made a great many calculations and is making one more. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney. He said nothing further. Around the study, the state investigators worked with the quiet efficiency of professionals who know exactly what they are looking for and have the full legal authority to look. The EPA team was already on the East Ridge with sampling equipment and GPS units. Jake arrived at 7:15, having driven Carol's car 7 miles on his learner's permit because he had spent 2 years sorting Frank's papers and knew the cross-reference system, and Patricia put him to work on the secondary document chain without ceremony. He sat at the cleared corner of the desk and worked with the focused attention of a 16-year-old who has found the specific thing he is good at. Ruth stood at the south-facing window of the study and looked at the town below. The elementary school, the water tower, the rooftops of the lower township spread out along the creek corridor where Frank had run calls for 23 years. The town that had been drinking contaminated water for 8 years without knowing what was in it. The town whose water as of this morning was being tested daily and would continue to be tested until the remediation was complete. Cole appeared beside her. He stood without crowding the window, and they were quiet together for a moment. He said the EPA team found 4 additional dump sites on the ridge. Preliminary readings on the water table are consistent with 8 years of contamination. Ray Decker says it is the most significant industrial contamination case in this district in 15 years. Ruth said Frank thought it had been going on for at least 8 years. The earliest pattern data in the journal goes back that far. Cole said your husband documented it before the EPA had instruments in place to confirm it. She said he knew what he was looking at. Cole said yes. He paused. When this is finished, I want to do something. For this town. Something lasting. Not for credit. He paused again. Just because the water was poisoned and the man who documented it died of it, and nobody should have to live in a town and not know what is in the water. Ruth said there is a contaminated parcel on the south side of town. Briggs's staging area, 8 acres. It will be in the asset seizure. When the remediation is complete, it will need a purpose. Cole said, what did Frank want for this town? She thought about it properly. She thought about the man at the kitchen table in the evenings when the documentation was done for the night, and he was just Frank, the man she had been married to for 31 years. He had talked about the elementary school. He had talked about the places where children played and how they had gotten old and the budgets had not kept up, and the playgrounds had equipment that needed replacing, and the shade trees that had died had not been replanted. She said he wanted children to have places to run. Cole said then that is what it will be. He said it simply the way people say things they have already decided rather than things they are still considering. Not a plan, a commitment. She looked at Cole Mercer and the study of the man who had poisoned the water of the town where Frank had worked and died, and she thought about Route 9 22 years ago, and the 45 minutes, and the quiet even voice, and the worst joke she had ever told, and that Frank had never stopped asking her to tell. She said he would have liked you. Cole said, I think I would have liked him. She put her hand briefly on the journal. She said, I know you would have. Briggs was transported at 9 in the morning. He walked to the vehicle with the careful composure of a man who has decided composure is his last available asset. Ruth did not watch him go. She was working through the journal with Patricia's team page by page, translating Frank's notation system and cross-reference structure into the language that the investigative record required. Jake worked beside her at the corner of the desk, methodical and quiet and very good. At one point, Patricia came to look at the secondary document chain he had assembled and stood reading it for 3 minutes without speaking, and then said, "How did you learn this?" Jake said, "I've been sorting his papers for 2 years." Patricia said, "You have good instincts for this." Jake said, without looking up from the documents, "I've been thinking about studying environmental law." Patricia said that would be a good use of those instincts. Jake nodded once in the short, decisive way of someone confirming a decision rather than considering one. The news reached Mill Haven in layers, the way significant news reaches small towns. The EPA vehicles on the Ridge Road at sunrise. The state police vehicles at the compound gate visible from the town below. The AG's office alert on the Columbus Station's app at 9:47. By 10 in the morning, Mill Haven had the full shape of the thing. Ruth knew it secondhand from texts and calls while she worked. She did not break for any of it. She had a job in this room, and the job mattered more than watching the information move through the world. At noon, Patricia sat across the desk from her and said, "We have enough. We have more than enough. The documentation chain is airtight. The witness recordings are sufficient to establish Briggs's direct authorization." She paused. "I want to tell you what happens next." She laid out the timeline. Criminal charges would take time, these cases always did. But the EPA emergency order was immediate. The municipal water monitoring was in place as of that morning. The contaminated parcels on the ridge were under federal environmental hold. The asset freeze on Briggs's personal and corporate holdings had been filed. She said nobody moves money and nobody moves materials. Ruth said in the remediation. Patricia said the asset seizure funds it. The timeline will be set by the EPA district office, but Ray Decker's preliminary assessment suggests the contamination, while serious, has not yet reached levels requiring full infrastructure replacement. The creek corridor and water table will need years of monitoring, but the town's infrastructure is salvageable. Ruth said, "I'd like to have the journal back when the legal process is complete." Patricia said, "That is a reasonable request, and I will document it. When the evidentiary process closes, it comes back to you." Ruth nodded. She sat in the cleared study of a man who would not be using it again in the October morning light, and she felt the thing she had been carrying since the workshop drawer 3 years ago shift in its position, not disappear, not resolve, change its weight and its character, become something that could be set down in one sense while still being carried in another. The arraignment came in November. Briggs entered a not guilty plea, and his attorneys were very good. Patricia had expected this and prepared for it. The bail was set at an amount that required Briggs to put the compound on the East Ridge as collateral, because the federal asset freeze had reduced his liquid holdings to the point where the compound was the most substantial, unencumbered asset he had left. The trial began the following April, almost exactly 6 months after the night on Route 9. It ran for 3 weeks. Ruth attended the days when Frank's documentation was entered into evidence, when Ray Decker testified as an expert witness, and when Patricia walked the jury through the journal page by careful page, projecting each one on the courtroom screen. Frank's handwriting in his careful capitals. The notation system of a man who had been trained to record what he found accurately and completely. She was in the courtroom when Patricia said to the jury, "Frank Allen Calloway documented what he found because he understood that documentation was the only protection available to a person without institutional power against a person with institutional power. He did it carefully and completely. He did it while his own body was being damaged by the compounds he was documenting. He did it because it was the right thing to do, and because he believed, with the specific quiet faith of a person who has spent his working life in the space between harm and help, that what he documented would eventually matter." She was in the courtroom when the verdict came. Guilty on 11 of 13 counts: environmental fraud, conspiracy, contract for violence against an identified group. Patricia said the 2 counts that did not hold were the 2 that required the strongest inference from the record rather than direct evidence, and that the counts that held were sufficient for the sentencing range she had been working toward. Ruth sat in the courtroom with Cole beside her and Jake on her other side and Carol in the row behind, and she heard the verdict and she felt the weight shift again. She reached into her jacket pocket and put her hand on the journal, which she carried there every day now, and she held it for a moment without taking it out. Jake leaned over and said quietly, "The documentation did it." Ruth said, "The documentation always does it. That is why you write things down." Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been in contact with Patricia's colleague at the AG's office. About the work, she says I ask good questions." Ruth said, "I know. She told me." He said, "I want to do that second part. The part that takes what Frank documented and makes it matter in a room like this." Ruth looked at her nephew with his grandfather's jaw and the steady light eyes and the quality she had recognized at Carol's kitchen table at 2 in the morning. She said, "I think Frank would have found that exactly right." Jake nodded once, the short, decisive nod of a confirmed decision. The sentencing came 2 months later, 8 years on the primary counts in a civil liability judgment that attached to every asset, personal and corporate. Briggs Industrial Waste went into federal receivership and was wound down, the proceeds directed to the remediation fund. The Briggs compound on the East Ridge was placed on the county auction block in December. The Millhaven Land Trust, incorporated 3 months earlier by a board that included Ruth Calloway Cole Mercer and Patricia Holman, submitted the highest bid. The compound was cleared and repurposed in stages through the following year. The main house became the administrative offices of the Millhaven Environmental Health Center, a nonprofit established with the remediation fund surplus to provide ongoing water quality monitoring and public health services to the lower townships. The east lawn, where the helicopter pad had been, was planted as a native prairie restoration that served as a demonstration site for the EPA district office's community education program. The private road Briggs had graded at his personal expense was open to public use and became the East Ridge Trail, a 2-mile walking and cycling path connecting the South Lot Park to the viewpoint above the old Millbridge overpass. The South Lot Park itself had been built the previous spring on the last Saturday of April by chapter members and town volunteers working together over 3 Saturdays in March, which had been exactly as loud as Ruth had anticipated, because when you put 40 men with power tools in proximity to a varying number of town residents who have brought food and strong opinions about post-setting, the result is not quiet. It was, however, solid. The playground structure had been installed by a contractor who gave a substantial discount and explained that his daughter was in 2nd grade at Millhaven Elementary and he had considered it a professional obligation. The picnic shelter was properly anchored and had a roof that would still be standing in 20 years. The marker at the north end of the park was placed on the last day of construction. Granite, properly set in concrete. Frank's name and the dates, and below them, the words that Jake had suggested. He told the truth, and he wrote it down. Ruth stood in front of it on that last Saturday of April with the sun on it and the spring light across the new grass and the playground equipment bright in the distance. In the town of Millhaven, going about its Saturday morning around the edges of the park that had been built on the lot where Harlan Briggs had staged the barrels that contributed to killing Frank Calloway. Cole stood beside her. He had been standing beside her for most of the morning, not performing the standing, not marking it as ceremony. Simply present the way that presence becomes a fact when it is consistent enough for long enough. He said, "How does it look?" She said, "It looks right." He said, "Frank would think so." She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things that deserve care. She thought about the man who had sat at the kitchen table with his graph paper journal and his quiet, even voice, and his terrible joke that he had requested from her 40 times without once laughing, and who had stayed on a cold road for 45 minutes because the protocol said wait, and the man in front of him needed more than wait. She said he would think it was correct and thorough, and that it had been done properly. Then he would go back to whatever he was doing. Cole said, "A man who understood that the work is the thing." She said, "Yes, exactly right." The chapter was assembled on the South Lot in their formation for occasions that mattered. 43 bikes in ranked rows, members standing beside them, the specific gravity of a group of people who have chosen together to mark something. There were town residents present as well, people Ruth knew from the clinic and from the roads and from years of being neighbors, and their children were on the new playground equipment, making the sounds that children make on playgrounds, which are not complicated sounds, but are the right sounds for a Saturday morning in April. Cole said, "I want to do a ride through town and then out on Route 9. The full chapter. He paused, just to mark it, because some things should be marked in the way you know how. Ruth said, "I think that is right." He said, "You'll ride with us." She looked at him. He said, "Passenger seat, unless you want to follow in the truck." She said, "I don't know how to drive a motorcycle." He said, "I know that. I meant passenger, behind me." Ruth Calloway, 72 years old, former emergency room nurse, widow, no longer in the sense of carrying what had happened alone, looked at Cole Mercer in the April sunlight beside Frank's marker with the chapter behind him in the town around them. She said, "Passenger seat." He nodded once. She put Frank's journal in the inside pocket of her clinic jacket, which she was wearing because Saturday was a clinic day, and she had come directly from a morning shift, and she walked to where Cole's Road King was parked at the edge of the lot. She got on. The chapter came alive around them. 43 engines in the April morning, the sound of them filling the south lot and the surrounding streets with the particular quality that Ruth had heard from the road in the dark last October when she had stepped out of her truck to stop it, and that she now understood differently than she had understood it then. Then she had heard it as something she needed to intercept. Now she understood it as the sound of a specific kind of force that was not violence and not gentleness, but something that covered more ground than either something organized and purposeful and committed to the things it had decided to be committed to. Cole pulled out onto Main Street, and the column came behind 43 bikes in formation through Millhaven on a Saturday morning. The town came to its sidewalks the way towns come to sidewalks when something is happening that people want to witness. Ruth sat in the passenger seat with Frank's journal over her heart, and the April wind and the sound of the column around her, and the streets of the town going by on either side. They rode past the elementary school. The children were out at recess. Ruth looked at them. Ordinary, the correct outcome. Everything had been done in service of this ordinary Saturday morning at a school in a town where the water was safe. They rode past the county health office and the diner on Main Street in the Route 9 intersection, and then they were on Route 9 itself heading east, and after 2 miles they came to the old Mill Bridge overpass. Cole slowed as they approached the span, and the column behind him slowed, and they moved under the bridge at walking pace, the sound of the engines filling the concrete throat of the underpass and bouncing back from both directions. At once, the way road noise always did under the span. The way that had always made the radio go strange for 4 seconds. The way that Ruth had always quietly liked, because it was a reminder that the world was full of ordinary phenomena that were also, if you paid attention, quietly remarkable. Ruth looked at the creek through the bridge railing as they passed through. It was moving south the way it had always moved south. The same creek it had always been carrying what was in it toward the town. The difference now was that what was in it was being measured, and the sources of what should not have been in it had been addressed, and in a few months the water would be cleaner, and in a few years cleaner still. They came out the far side of the bridge into the April morning, and Cole let the Road King come up to road speed, and the column behind him did the same. The sound of them rising from the procession register to the full traveling chorus of a group of machines in motion, and Ruth felt the air against her face and the engine through the frame and the weight of the journal against her chest. She thought about Frank. She thought about the 45 minutes on Route 9 22 years ago. A cold road and a 26-year-old man in a drainage ditch and a paramedic with a quiet, even voice who had come down the embankment instead of waiting at the road because the protocol said wait, and the man in front of him needed more than wait. She thought about the graph paper journal on the kitchen table and the way he had held her hand in October 3 years ago with the last breath that had enough force left in it for one full word. Ruth. She thought about the marker on the new grass of the South Lot granite in the April sun. He told the truth and he wrote it down. They rode east on Route 9, and the Ohio countryside moved past them on both sides. The fields and the tree lines and the county roads branching off toward the townships, where people had been drinking the water and going to work and raising children and living their ordinary lives, which were now continuing in better condition than they had been in for 8 years. Because a paramedic had kept records and his wife had kept them in a glove box and had stood in the road one October night with her arms up. The ordinary morning of the world was around her, and she was in it, and she let herself feel the things she had been setting aside for 3 years, setting aside for later for when it was time. It was time now. The road was good. The morning was good. She had work at the clinic that afternoon, and a patient she had promised to see personally, and a 29-year-old resident who had become a 30-year-old resident and was getting steadily better at the job. She had a nephew who was going to study environmental law and a sister who made biscuits when she couldn't sleep, and a loose board on the third step of Carol's front porch that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She had a truck with a heater vent that only worked on the driver's side if you held it open with a matchbook, and she had been thinking since the South Lot Park was finished that this winter she would finally take the truck to the garage and have it fixed properly. Not yet. This season first. This particular ordinary spring with its April light and the creek running south in the column of steel pennants MC, moving east on Route 9, and Frank's journal over her heart. She rode. Cole said one thing raised over the wind. "You okay back there?" She said yes. She said it once and she meant it fully. The road ran east through Ohio in April, the same road it had always been, and she was on it, going forward, both hands holding on, which was exactly right, which was exactly what the moment required. She had been a nurse for 35 years. She had learned in her first year of nursing that the work is the thing, that you show up and you do the work that the moment requires, and you stay when the protocol says wait, because sometimes the man in front of you needs more than the protocol offers. She had learned it from watching people do it, and she had learned it from doing it herself, and she had married a man who knew it in his bones and had taught it to her again every day for 31 years just by being the kind of person he was. The road came up to meet them and fell away behind, and the April morning was around them, and ahead was the town and the clinic and the patient she had promised, and the afternoon shift and the long ordinary business of a life that was continuing, that had kept on continuing, that was not finished, that had more work in it, yet more mornings and more routes and more people who needed someone to stay when the protocol said wait. Ruth Calloway rode east on Route 9 into the April morning, with the engine beneath her and the journal over her heart and the wind in her face, and she did not think about what was behind her. She thought about what was ahead, which is what you do when you have done the work that needed doing. And the morning is here, and it is good, and the road is going forward. Forward. The East Ridge Road to the Briggs compound ran 2 miles through the October dark above Millhaven, and Ruth knew every curve of it. She had driven past the compound gate many times over 22 years in the county the way you drive past landmarks that define a landscape without being part of your life, noting them as reference points rather than destinations. Briggs's compound was the kind of place that declared its own importance through architecture. The masonry wall, 8 feet high along the road frontage, the custom copper-clad steel gate, the sensor lighting that swept 40 feet in both directions, the private road that Briggs had paid to have graded and paved 3 years back when the county road budget declined to maintain the original track. It was the compound of a man who understood that visible security was its own message. It said, I have enough to protect and enough resources to protect it, and you should calibrate your behavior toward me accordingly. Ruth had spent 2 years thinking about what was behind that gate. She had driven past it on the way to the clinic and on the way home, and she had thought about Frank's journal in the glove box, and about the county health office, and about the slow weight of a thing that needed doing that she could not figure out how to do alone. She was not alone tonight. The column of steel pennants MC moved through the dark ahead of her engines at travel speed headlights, cutting the ridge road in a chain of light that went 200 yards before it curved away into the dark. Cole was at the head of it on his Road King, and behind him were the 43 men of his chapter and the 60 from affiliated chapters who had answered the regional muster. And behind all of them was Ruth Calloway in her 22-year-old truck with the matchbook in the heater vent and Frank's journal on the passenger seat. 103 machines on the East Ridge Road at 2 in the morning. Cole cut the column's lights 200 yards from the gate. They came to a stop on the Ridge Road in the dark engines, idling, the collective sound of them low and patient and completely unhurried. Ruth pulled her truck off the road behind the last bike and sat with the engine running and looked at the compound gate 200 yards ahead. The lights were on in the main house, second floor south-facing study. The sensor lights on the perimeter wall were running in full activation mode, which meant either someone had turned them on manually or a motion detector had triggered them. Either way, someone inside knew the road was occupied. Cole came to her window. He said, "We hold here. Patricia's authorization is 90 minutes out. We don't go through that gate before it comes through. But nothing comes out through that gate before it comes through." Ruth said, "Understood." He said, "There's a helicopter pad on the east lawn." She said, "I know. I've seen it in the county zoning appeal documents. It's in the public record." Cole said, "Sawyer has two men on the ridge above the pad. Let them try." Garrett Boone materialized at the passenger side of the truck, the way Boone materialized at places he had silently decided he needed to be, which was without announcement and without ceremony. He was carrying two coffees in paper cups. He handed one through the window. Ruth said, "Where did those come from?" Boone said Sawyer had a thermos. She said, "Tell him thank you." Boone said he'll be pleased. He paused. "He's going to be all right." The shoulder. Ruth said if he follows instructions, it will be fine in 3 weeks. Possibly 2.5 if he is disciplined about the exercises. He has the discipline for it. Boone said he does. He has the discipline for most things. He paused in the way that large, quiet men pause when they are deciding whether to say the next thing. "He has been telling the chapter about you, about what you did at the tailgate tonight. He said it was the most efficient work he has seen done outside of a forward surgical unit." Ruth said that is a significant comparison. Boone said he does not make comparisons he does not mean. He moved away from the window with the unhurried economy that characterized all of his movements back to his position beside Cole's bike at the head of the column. Ruth drank the coffee, which was strong, in the right temperature, and she watched the compound gate, and she thought about Frank. She thought specifically about the last year. The year when the sitting forward at the kitchen table had become necessary because lying flat was no longer possible, when the distance from the bedroom to the bathroom had become a project requiring planning, when the breath that used to carry a full sentence began to shorten incrementally, a clause at a time, until the sentences had to be arranged differently, shorter, more essential until only the essential things got said. She had learned in that year what the essential things were. She had already known in the abstract way that you know things you have not yet been required to know fully. But the year had made her know it in the specific, concrete way that experience produces the knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. She thought about this night in October 3 years ago when he had reached for her hand. The kitchen was dark except for the lamp over the table. The oxygen concentrator was running its quiet, continuous note. He had reached for her hand, and she had given it to him, and he had held it with the specific grip of a man who is putting something into the keeping of another person, the deliberate grip rather than the reflexive one. He had said her name, Ruth, one syllable, enough breath for it, and then he had looked at her with the complete attention of a man saying the thing he most needs to say and trusting that it will be understood without further elaboration. She had understood. She understood now on the East Ridge Road in the October dark, with the Briggs compound gate 200 yards ahead and Frank's journal on the passenger seat, and 103 motorcycles ranged between her truck and the gate, that the 3 years of the glove box had not been cowardice and had not been inaction. They had been the necessary interval between the moment of understanding and the moment of capacity, the time it took for the world to arrange itself into a configuration where understanding and capacity could meet. The world had arranged itself tonight. She finished the coffee. She set the cup on the dash beside the matchbook. She opened Frank's journal to the first page where his name was written in the clean, unhurried way he wrote everything. Frank Allen Calloway. The date, documentation. She held it under the interior light for a moment. Then she closed it and set it back on the passenger seat and looked at the gate. At 2:47 in the morning, a light came on in the helicopter pad building. One of Sawyer's men came through on the radio, immediately motioned in the pad, building someone prepping the rotor. Cole's response was immediate. 2 men visible on the ridge above the pad, let them see the position. 40 seconds later, the light in the pad building went off. The compound's lights stayed on in the study. Ruth thought about Harlan Briggs in that room, 61 years old, a man who had built something over 30 years through a combination of genuine operational intelligence and a complete absence of whatever mechanism in most people produces a hesitation before doing the thing that will harm others. She had been thinking about him for 2 years in the careful, specific way that she thought about adversaries, not with hatred, which was wasteful and imprecise, but with the detailed attention of someone who needs to understand how a thing works in order to address it effectively. He would be doing the arithmetic. He was the kind of man who was always doing the arithmetic. The bridge had failed. The Miller Road operation had gone silent. The Ridge Road had 100+ motorcycles on it, and the helicopter pad had men above it, and the gate was holding, but only because he had not yet tried the gate. And when he tried the gate, he would find out what held it and what did not. He was doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was coming up the same way no matter how many times he ran it. Ruth thought good. She thought it without pleasure. She thought it with the specific, flat satisfaction of a nurse who has arrived at the correct diagnosis after a long differential, not triumph, just accuracy. The situation was what it was. The arithmetic was correct. What came next would come next, and it would be what the documentation and the law and the patient work of the people on this road had made it. At 4:15, Ray Decker's text came through. On site, documentation chain confirmed, samples in custody, preliminary readings consistent with long-term Class 6 contamination, 8 years minimum. Ruth, this is more than enough. She read it twice. She thought about Frank pulling the MSDS sheets from the Briggs facility's regulatory filings. She thought about him plotting incident locations on graph paper at the kitchen table, his reading glasses on the oxygen concentrator running its note in the corner, working with the focused patience of a man who understands that thoroughness is not optional. Ray had been Frank's supervisor for 7 years at Station 4 before the EPA field office position came up. He had sat in their kitchen and eaten Carol's biscuits and argued with Frank about the Ohio State defensive line and taught Ruth how to play cribbage one rainy November when the power was out and they had played by candlelight for 4 hours. He had been at the memorial service. He had stood at the back of the room and had not said much and had shaken Ruth's hand on the way out, with both of his, the way people shake hands when words are not sufficient. He had called her 8 months after Frank died to say that he was putting together a secondary file on Briggs Industrial and that if she ever had anything she could share, the door was open. She had said, I have something. I have Frank's journal. And then she had not called back for 18 months because carrying something and knowing what to do with it are not the same problem, and she had needed the interval to close the distance between them. She was very glad sitting on the East Ridge Road in the October dark that she had finally closed it. At 4:40, Patricia called. The warrant was processing, the judge had been reached at home. The authorization was moving through the proper channels at the speed that proper channels move when there is genuine urgency and genuine documentation behind the request. Patricia said, I want to ask you something directly. When this becomes public, your husband's name will be central to the record. His documentation is the primary evidentiary chain. How do you feel about that? Ruth did not answer immediately. She sat with the question for the time it deserved. Then she said, Frank spent 3 years building something because he believed it would matter. It was always supposed to be used. The whole point of building it was that it would eventually be used. She paused. I think he would be glad that the right people are using it now, and I think he would want his name on it not for credit, but because the name means that the work was done by a real person who understood what he was documenting and chose to document it anyway. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, I think that is exactly right. She paused. I'm sorry it took this long to get here. Ruth said it took what it took. The interval was part of the process. She said it without bitterness and without resignation. Those were both the wrong registers. The right register was the one that acknowledged the reality of the interval, the 3 years, and the glove box and the county health office visits that went nowhere without assigning them more weight than they deserved. They had happened. They were part of the shape of the thing. They did not change the destination. At 5:20, Cole came back to her window. He leaned his arms on the doorframe and looked at her with the expression of a man who is about to say something he has been organizing for a while. He said, I want to tell you the rest of what happened on Route 9. She waited. He said, I was 26 and I had 2 broken ribs and a shoulder that was not in its correct position and a head injury that had done something strange to the way time was working. I would have intervals of clarity and then intervals where the clarity went, and I was somewhere else, somewhere that felt like the inside of a very long, dark tunnel, and I could not reliably find my way back from those intervals on my own. He said, "Your husband kept talking to me. Every time I started to go under, he brought me back. He had a specific method. He would say my name first, Cole, just that. And then he would say something ordinary, something that had nothing to do with where I was or what was happening, and the ordinariness of it was the thing. It gave me something outside the tunnel to orient toward. He said at one point I was under for what felt like a long time, and when I came back, he was in the middle of telling me about a patient he had that week. A man in his 80s who had come in from a fall and who had in the waiting room attempted to teach everyone in the waiting room how to play gin rummy. He said this man had produced a deck of cards from his jacket pocket as if this were entirely normal and had begun distributing hands to everyone within reach. Your husband said this man had the specific confidence of someone who has decided that the situation in front of him is simply an opportunity that most people are not seeing clearly. Cole paused. He said I came back from wherever I had been because I needed to find out whether the man won. Ruth said softly, "Did the man win?" Cole said your husband said the man won 3 rounds before the nurse came to get him, and that he pocketed the cards on the way in as if he might need them again later. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. She knew that patient. She had heard that story. Frank had told it at dinner 3 or 4 years ago with the specific quiet enjoyment of a person relaying something that had genuinely delighted him. He had told it the way he told the best stories evenly, without performing the delight letting the material carry it. She said that was Mr. Adkins, 79 years old, fell while putting up gutters. He had been a car dealer in Atlantic City for 11 years in his 30s, and he never entirely stopped treating every room as a potential table. Cole said that is a perfect detail. She said Frank collected perfect details. It was one of the things about him. Cole said, I know. I could tell even then, even coming in and out of wherever my brain was taking me. He had the quality of a man who pays specific attention to the specific things in front of him. She said, yes, he did. Cole said, I want to tell you one more thing. When the second unit finally arrived and they were getting me onto the backboard, he leaned in close and he said in a voice that was clearly for me, only you're going to be fine. And I want you to know that I am going to be fine too, in case you were worried about me. Ruth made a sound. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and it was exactly the right sound for the thing it was expressing. Cole said I had been so focused on getting through it that I hadn't realized I was worried about him too. The idea that he knew that and said something about it. She said that was very like him. Cole said yes. I had been in the company of that man for 45 minutes in the worst situation of my life, and I understood exactly what kind of person he was from those 45 minutes. The journal confirms it. Every page confirms it. He paused. He said, I am glad that what he built is going to do what he built it to do. Ruth said, yes, I am glad of that too. Cole straightened from the window. He stood for a moment in the October dark looking at the gate 200 yards up the road. He said, you know what the joke tells me? She said, which part of it? He said the part where he told it to me. He said it was your favorite joke. He said he had never once laughed at it and that he would never stop asking you to tell it. That is a man who understands that the things we love about the people we love are not always the things that make sense to anyone else, and that this is not a problem to be solved, but a feature to be appreciated. Ruth said he was a very sensible man. Cole said he was a very good man. She said yes, those overlap significantly in his case. Cole went back to the column. Ruth sat with the coffee cup and the journal in the October dark, in the sound of 103 engines at patient idle. And she thought about Frank until the sky in the east began to separate from the dark in that specific pre-dawn way that is not yet light, but is the absence of the most complete dark. The first announcement that the sun is organizing itself somewhere below the horizon and will arrive on schedule. At 5:58, Patricia Holman's headlights appeared at the bottom of the Ridge Road, followed by 2 unmarked state vehicles in an EPA emergency response van. They came up the road in a deliberate procession and stopped behind the last motorcycle in the column. Patricia got out. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the expression of someone who had been awake for 2 hours and had arrived exactly where she intended to arrive. She walked directly to Ruth's window. She said, I've read the first 12 pages. Ruth waited. Patricia said it is extraordinary work, methodical, cross-referenced, and documented to a standard that a courtroom will find entirely credible. Your husband understood what he was building, and he built it correctly. Ruth said he was trained as a hazmat responder before paramedicine. He knew what the standards were. Patricia said it shows. She paused. Are you ready to walk me through the primary documentation inside? Ruth said yes. They walked to the gate together. Patricia had the warrant in hand, and she pressed the intercom and said her name and her title and the name of the Ohio Attorney General and said, I am presenting a warrant signed by Judge William Hartwell of the 6th District at 5:43 this morning for search and seizure at this address. Open this gate now. The gate opened. Inside the compound's main house in the second-floor study, with the lights that had been burning since before 2 in the morning, Harlan Briggs was standing behind his desk. He had not slept. He had not changed from his evening clothes. He had a glass in his hand that was not empty and had not been empty for most of the night, though it had been refilled several times. And he had the specific look of a man who has been running arithmetic that does not produce a satisfactory answer no matter how many times he runs it. He looked at Patricia Holman. He looked at the investigators flanking her. He looked at Ruth Calloway in the clinic jacket, 72 years old, holding a hard-covered graph paper journal in both hands, with a specific grip of someone carrying something that belongs to someone who is not there to carry it themselves. Briggs said, I want to speak to my attorney. Patricia said, you may call your attorney. While you are doing that, my investigators will proceed with the document seizure authorized under this warrant. She unfolded the document and read him the relevant paragraph. She said, Mr. Briggs, I want to be very clear about what we have. We have 14 months of contemporaneous documentation by a licensed paramedic and hazmat responder of your company's illegal disposal of Class 6 toxic compounds in the drainage corridor east of Mill Haven. We have EPA field confirmation of water table contamination consistent with that documentation, with preliminary readings suggesting contamination going back at least 8 years. We have recorded testimony placing you personally as the direct authorizing source of a contract for violence against the Steel Pennants MC chapter leadership. We have a 2-year secondary investigation by this office into your company's systematic fraudulent environmental compliance reporting. She set the warrant on the edge of his desk. She said your attorney will tell you the same thing I am telling you now, which is that the weight of this documentation makes cooperation your best, and in fact your only viable option. Briggs looked at each element of the room. He looked at the investigators who were already beginning to move toward the filing cabinets. He looked at Cole Mercer standing in the doorway with his arms folded. He looked at Ruth. He said, whose journal is that? Ruth said, Frank Allen Calloway. Paramedic, Mill Haven Station, 423 years of service. My husband. He spent 3 years documenting what your company was doing to this town's water supply. He did it because he was trained to document what he found, and because he believed that documentation was the thing that made facts matter in the world. He paused, she paused, and the pause held the weight it needed to hold. And then she said, he died of pulmonary fibrosis 16 months after he started the documentation. The specific compound class on those barrels in the panel van is consistent with producing interstitial pulmonary fibrosis through chronic low-level inhalation exposure. He was running calls in that contaminated corridor for 6 years. Briggs looked at her. Ruth said he built what he built. It brought this here. She looked at him steadily. It is going to do what it is going to do. Briggs picked up his phone. He called his attorney. He said nothing further. The investigators worked. Ruth stood at the south-facing window and looked at the town below in the October dawn. The elementary school. The water tower with the town's name on it in letters large enough to read from the ridge. The rooftops of the lower townships spread along the creek corridor where Frank had run calls for 23 years. First in the ambulance and then in the final years mostly in his truck, because his breathing no longer allowed the physical demands of the full paramedicine role. But he had kept going, kept the records, kept cross-referencing, kept building the thing that now stood in this room as the weight it had always been meant to be. Jake arrived at 7:15. He had driven Carol's car 7 miles on a learner's permit because he was 16 and he knew the cross-reference system in the documents. And he had decided that his presence was necessary, and had spent 35 minutes convincing Carol, which by Carol's own later account was not as long as it should have been. He came into the study with the particular combination of self-consciousness and determination of a teenager who has inserted himself into a significant situation and is prepared to justify the insertion. He looked at Patricia. He said, "I know the filing system. I've been sorting Frank's papers for 2 years. I know how the cross-references work between the journal and the county regulatory records. You need someone who can run the secondary document chain while Ruth handles the primary documentation. I can do that." Patricia looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Secondary chain. Flag anything with a date in the 3-year window and a county office reference. Touch nothing in the primary documentation." Jake sat at the corner of the cleared desk and began. He was good. Ruth watched him for 10 minutes while she answered Patricia's questions about the journal's notation system, and she was able to see clearly and without the distortion of familial partiality that he was genuinely good at it. He had the instinct for documentary cross-reference that was partly learned and partly native, the ability to hold multiple threads simultaneously and see where they intersected, which was the core skill of what Patricia did and what Frank had done and what the law required when it was working correctly. At one point, Patricia came to look at what Jake had assembled on the secondary chain and stood reading it for several minutes without speaking. She said, "How did you develop this approach?" Jake said, "I learned from the journal and from watching Ruth sort through the county health office responses." Patricia said, "You have good instincts for this work." Jake said without looking up, "I've been thinking about environmental law." Patricia said that would be a good use of these instincts. Jake said, "I know." He paused. "I've been corresponding with your colleague at the Columbus office. She says I ask good questions." Patricia said she mentioned that to me. Ruth did not look up from the journal page she was annotating for the investigative record, but she felt something settle in her chest that had the specific quality of a thing being properly completed, a circuit closing the last step of a process that has been building across a long time and many people and has finally arrived at its correct conclusion. The morning moved forward. The investigators worked through the filing cabinets and the desk drawers and the shelving behind the desk, where Briggs had kept his operational records in the color-coded binders of a man who had once been proud of the systems he had built. Each binder was opened, documented, and added to the evidence chain. Jake flagged 12 items on the secondary chain in the first 2 hours. Each one added a line to the documentation of the gap between what Briggs's company had reported to the county environmental office and what it had actually been doing. The gap was significant. The gap was the case. At 9 in the morning, Briggs was transported by 2 state investigators to the county detention facility. He walked to the vehicle with the composure of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing available to him. His attorney was present. The attorney was very good, which Ruth had known he would be. It would not be enough. When the documentation is thorough, and the chain of custody is unbroken, and the witnesses are credible, and the physical evidence confirms every claim in the record, a very good attorney is still operating within the constraints of what the evidence allows, and the evidence did not allow much. The news moved through Millhaven in layers. The EPA vehicles on the Ridge Road at sunrise, visible from the town below. The state police vehicles at the compound gate by 8 in the morning. The AG's alert on the Columbus Station's app at 9:47. By 10 o'clock, Millhaven had the full shape of the thing. Ruth knew it secondhand from text while she worked, and she did not stop working to track it because the work in the study was more important than watching the information move. At noon, Patricia sat across the desk from Ruth and said, "We have everything we need." She laid out what came next. The criminal process would be slow. These cases were always slow, but the immediate protective actions were already in place. The water monitoring, the federal hold on the contaminated parcels, the asset freeze. She said the remediation will be funded by the asset seizure. The preliminary assessment suggests the contamination has not yet reached the level requiring full infrastructure replacement. Years of monitoring and treatment ahead, but the town's water infrastructure is salvageable. Ruth said good. She said it the way she said things that were exactly what they needed to be, simply without decoration. Patricia said, "I'd like to keep the journal in official custody through the trial. I will document your request to have it returned when the evidentiary process closes. Ruth said, I appreciate that. She set the journal on the desk between them. She had been holding it for most of the morning, and setting it down felt like the right thing to do in this moment. A small ceremony of transfer appropriate to the occasion. Patricia put both hands on it briefly. She looked at Ruth. She said, I'll take good care of it. Ruth said, I know you will. Cole was waiting in the driveway when she came out. The column of steel pennants MC had moved off the road and was arranged on the wide gravel of the private drive. Men standing beside their bikes' engines, quiet the specific patience of people who have been up all night and are running on something beyond ordinary energy. The thing that keeps people going when they are doing the thing that most needs doing. Cole walked with her to her truck. He said Ray Decker's full report will be filed by Monday. The EPA district has already issued the emergency interim monitoring order for the municipal intake. Daily testing from today forward until full remediation is certified. Ruth said good. He said there is one more thing I want to say to you. She looked at him. They were standing beside her truck in the October morning, the east ridge falling away below them toward the town, the first full light of the day coming across the ridge from the east. He said, I have spent 22 years thinking about the man on Route 9. Not every day, not obsessively, but with a particular quality of thought that returns periodically the way certain experiences return, not because you are thinking about them, but because they have become part of the structure of how you understand things. He paused. I have spent those 22 years with a debt I could not pay because I did not know who it was owed to. Ruth was very still. He said, I want you to understand that what was done tonight, all of it, the documentation chain, and the warrant, and the water monitoring, and whatever comes after all of it, traces back to the 45 minutes on Route 9. Because the man who stayed on that road became the reason I was on this ridge road tonight. And the man who kept those records became the reason tonight was possible. He paused. The debt was to Frank, but you carried it for 3 years after he was gone. So the debt is also to you. Ruth looked at the compound gate now standing open. The state investigators and EPA team moving in and out with the methodical purpose of people with a long day's work ahead of them. She said Frank would say there was no debt. He would say he was doing his job. She paused. He would be right in one sense and wrong in another. He was doing his job, but he was doing it in the way that goes beyond the job. That part does create something. She thought about what to call it. She said it creates a kind of continuation. The thing you did tonight and what comes after it, that is the continuation of what he started on Route 9. He stayed. The staying produced something that went forward through time. It is still going forward. Cole said, yes, I understand that. She said, good. She opened the truck door. She picked up the journal from the passenger seat where it had ridden through the night, and she held it for a moment. Then she handed it back through the window to Cole. She said, take it back inside. It belongs with Patricia today. It has work to do. He took it with both hands. He looked at the cover, Frank Allen Calloway's name and the date, and the word documentation, and he held it for a moment with the same deliberate care that she had held it, the care that a thing deserves when it is both a tool and a memorial. He said, I'll bring it in. She said, I have a clinic shift at 2 o'clock. He looked at her. She said the resident needs supervision on a post-surgical follow-up, and there is a patient I promised personally to check in on. She paused. I have been up since 6 yesterday morning. I am going home first to shower and change, and then I am going to the clinic. Cole said, you are 72 years old and you have been up for 33 hours. She said, and I have a clinic shift at 2. She started the truck. The heater vent needed the matchbook, so she put it in place. The warm air came out on the driver's side. She said, I'll be in touch about the documentation schedule and about the South Lot parcel when the time comes. He said, the parcel will be handled. She said, I know it will. She put the truck in gear. She looked at Cole through the window standing on the private road of a compound that was in the process of being dismantled in every way that mattered, holding Frank's journal in both hands in the morning light. She said, thank you, for tonight and for 22 years ago. He said, that runs the other direction. She said, it runs in both directions. That is the nature of things that matter. She drove. The ridge road took her down from the compound toward Millhaven and Route 9. The same road she had been driving for 22 years in both directions. The road she knew the way, she knew the bones of her own hands. The October morning was fully established now, the light clean and cold, and coming from the east, the way October light does in Ohio, angled and specific, making the ordinary things of the landscape exact and clear. She drove past the south lot on the way through town. It was just a fenced, vacant parcel now, the contaminated staging area, with its legal notice and its hazmat posting and its chain link fence grown through with last year's weeds. She had driven past it many times and thought about what it was. She had not until this morning been able to think clearly about what it could become. She thought about it now. She thought about playground equipment and new grass and shade trees and a picnic shelter built properly with chapter labor and town residents working alongside each other on a Saturday in spring. She thought about a granite marker at the north end in the April light. She thought he would be glad. She drove home. She showered. She changed into clean clothes. She drank coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the table where Frank had worked in the evenings. The table was clean. She had cleared it of the copies she had been working from, and the county records she had been sorting, cleared it 2 days ago in a session that had felt like something ending and something beginning. The way the clearing of a working surface always feels when the work it held has moved somewhere else. She put her clinic jacket on. The name of the clinic was embroidered on the left chest, Millhaven Community Clinic, in the blue thread that had faded slightly over 2 years of washing. She would need a new one eventually. She had not gotten around to ordering it. She put Frank's journal in the inside pocket. Or she reached for it and found the pocket empty because the journal was not there. It was with Patricia Holman and the investigative team on the East Ridge doing the work it had been built to do. The pocket was empty, and she held her hand there for a moment, over the empty pocket over her heart. Then she took her hand away and picked up her keys. She drove to the clinic in the 22-year-old truck with the matchbook holding the heater vent. She was 40 minutes early, which gave her time to review the post-surgical notes on the patient she had promised to see and to look over the 3 intakes that Dr. Marcus Webb, the 29-year-old on loan from Columbus, had filed from the previous afternoon session. Dr. Webb arrived at 1:55, which was 5 minutes before his shift technically began, which was something he had started doing 2 months ago without being asked. He came in with 2 coffees from the diner across the street and put one on the nurse's station counter without comment. Ruth said, "How did you sleep?" Webb said, "I didn't. I was up reading the coverage on Briggs." She said, "Then drink that and focus. You have a post-surgical follow-up at 2:15, and I want to watch you manage the conversation with the family." He said, "You haven't slept either." She said, "I have 35 years of practice doing without. You have too. Drink the coffee." He drank the coffee. The post-surgical follow-up went well. Webb managed the family conversation with the patient's daughter, who was anxious and detail-focused and needed specific, accurate information presented clearly and without qualification, and Webb gave it to her in exactly that way, which Ruth noted and approved of without saying anything, because approval expressed too readily produced dependency, and she wanted him developing his own assessment of what good practice looked like. After the 2:15, he found her in the hallway. He said, "How did I do?" She said, "Good. You listened to the daughter before you answered. That was the right sequence." He said, "You taught me that." She said, "You learned it. There is a difference." He looked at her. He was 29 years old and good and getting better, and he had the particular quality that the best practitioners had in early development. The quality of someone who knows they are learning and wants to learn and is not yet afraid to be seen learning, which was the window in which the most durable learning happened. He said, "I'd like to talk to you sometime about the documentation work, what Frank was doing, how it worked as a methodology. I want to understand the system." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She said, "Tuesday afternoon, after the 2 o'clock, I'll bring the notes." He said, "Thank you." She said, "It will not be a short conversation." He said, "I have time." She went back to the nurse's station. The afternoon moved forward in the ordinary way of clinic afternoons, the intakes and the follow-ups, and the wound care, and the 3 walk-ins. One of whom was a 63-year-old retired school teacher named Mabel Riggins, who came in every 3 weeks with the particular cheerfulness of someone who is managing a chronic condition well and knows it and is pleased with herself about it. Mabel said you look like you've been up all night. Ruth said I've been up since 6 yesterday morning. Mabel said something happened last night. I saw the news alert on my phone. Ruth said yes, several things happened. Mabel looked at her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years reading rooms full of children and had developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the moment when someone is carrying something significant. She said, "Is it good?" Ruth said yes. "It is good." She paused. "It took a long time to get here, and it is good." Mabel said your husband would be pleased. Ruth said yes, he would. She said it simply, and it was simple, and it was true, and the simplicity of it was itself a form of relief. The relief of a thing being what it is without additional weight or qualification. She finished Mabel's intake. She saw the last 3 patients of the afternoon shift. She stayed to help Dr. Webb close out the day's records, walking him through the documentation protocol for 2 cases that had procedural complexity that required care. At 6:15, the clinic was quiet. She locked up. She walked to her truck in the parking lot behind the building. The October evening had come on while she was inside the sky in the west, going the specific amber and gray that Ohio Octobers produce, the light that lies flat and low across the fields and makes ordinary landscapes look briefly like paintings of themselves. She sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. She was tired in the way that a person is tired when they have been operating at full capacity for a long time and can finally stop. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes with a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of work completed. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her hand found the empty space where the journal had been. She stayed with the empty space for a moment. Then she started the truck. She put the matchbook in the heater vent. The warm air came out on the driver's side. She drove home. That evening she called Carol. Carol was making dinner and the sounds of the kitchen came through the phone, the particular domestic music of a person cooking in the evening. And it was one of the sounds Ruth most associated with the county, with home, with the ordinary continuing. Carol said Jake has been on the phone for 3 hours. He called Patricia Holman's colleague at the AG's office. He called Ray Decker to ask about the remediation process. He called a professor at Ohio State whose name he got from an article about environmental enforcement law. Ruth said of course he did. Carol said he is exactly like his grandfather. Ruth said yes. Carol said Dale would be very proud of him. Ruth said I know. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ruthie, I want to ask you something. Ruth waited. Carol said the matchbook. In the heater vent. Are you going to fix it? Ruth looked at the kitchen table. The clean surface where Frank had worked. The chair where he had sat in the evenings with the journal and the reading glasses, and the quiet, focused attention that had been his most consistent quality. She said this winter. I'll have it looked at this winter. Carol said, okay. Ruth said, I need this one season first. Just this one. Carol said, I understand. And she did. They were sisters and they understood each other with the specific understanding that comes from a lifetime of being in the same family and surviving the same losses and arriving at the same October evenings from different angles. And understanding was what they offered each other in the places where words were not quite right. Ruth made dinner. She ate at the kitchen table. She looked at Frank's chair across from her. She thought about what Cole had said. The continuation. The 45 minutes on Route 9 producing the thing that produced this going forward through time, past the point where the body could carry it any further. That was the nature of the things that mattered. They continued. She finished dinner. She washed the dishes. She went to bed at 8:30 in the evening, which was the earliest she had gone to bed in 3 years, and she was asleep before the clock had moved another 20 minutes. She dreamed which she rarely did or rarely remembered. She dreamed of Route 9 in April, the road going east in the morning light, with the fields on both sides green and new. The way Ohio looks in April when the winter is finally finished. She was driving the truck. The heater vent was working on both sides without the matchbook. The radio was playing without interruption, even under the Millbridge overpass. No 4-second gap, just the music going straight through. In the dream, this seemed exactly right. She was not surprised by it. She drove forward on the April road with both hands on the wheel and the windows down and the morning air coming in, and the dream had the specific quality of a dream that is not a wish for something that is gone, but a recognition of something that is still here. She drove forward. She woke at 6 in the morning. The October light was coming through the bedroom window at its low-angled October angle. She lay still for a moment and let herself be fully in the morning before the morning required anything of her. Then she got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter with the mug in both hands, looking at the table where Frank had sat. She thought today. She thought there is work. She thought yes. She drank the coffee. She went to get dressed. She put on the clinic jacket. She reached into the inside pocket out of the habit she had developed over the past weeks of reaching for the journal. The pocket was still empty. The journal was with Patricia Holman doing what it had been built to do. Ruth stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hand over the empty pocket over her heart. Then she let it go. She picked up her keys and the matchbook from the counter, and she went to the truck and she drove to work. The matchbook went in the heater vent. The warm air came out on the driver's side. Route 9 ran west toward the clinic, the same road it had always been. The Millbridge overpass came up ahead of her, and she drove through it at speed, the road narrowing under the concrete span and widening again on the far side, the creek visible through the railing below, moving south in the October morning, carrying what it carried. Clean water moving south. That was the thing. Clean water moving south through the Ohio countryside toward the town where Frank had worked, and the school where the children drank from the fountains, and the ordinary lives of the people who had been drinking that water for years without knowing what was in it. Clean water now, cleaner tomorrow, cleaner still in a year and in 5 years, and in the years after that, the slow remediation of the thing that had been done and the slow restoration of the thing. That remediation meant not the erasure of harm, but the address of it, the patient systematic work of going back to where the damage was done and making the ground safe again. Ruth Calloway drove through the Millbridge overpass on a morning in October and came out the other side into the day and the work and the life that was continuing, that was not finished, that had more in it yet. She drove forward, both hands on the wheel. Forward. The month after the conviction, Cole came to the clinic. He came through the front door on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in the waiting room with the specific stillness of a large man in a small space who was determined not to make his presence anyone else's problem. The 3 other patients in the waiting room noted him and returned to their phones or their magazines with the particular careful neutrality that people deploy when they have decided that a situation is not their concern. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been at the clinic for 16 months now, and had developed the particular peripheral awareness that comes from working in a small-town clinic where the unexpected arrival is a regular feature, came to find Ruth in the exam room. He said there is a man in the waiting room who says he is here for a check-in. Ruth said, what kind of check-in? Webb said, and I want to be precise here, he said that Ruth would know. Ruth dried her hands and went out. Cole was in the chair nearest the window. His cut was over a flannel shirt, the same worn leather with the chapter patch, President Steele Pennants MC. His hands were folded in his lap with the patience of a man who has had a great deal of practice waiting and has learned to do it without waste. Ruth sat in the chair beside him. She said, is something wrong? He said no. He paused. I have a question, and I want to ask it in person rather than on the phone, because some things should be said in person. She waited. He said, I have been thinking about how to say this since October, and I have not found a version I am entirely satisfied with, so I am going to say it in the version I have, and trust you to understand what I mean. She waited. He said, you stepped in front of my bike on Route 9 in the dark, and you did not know us, and you stopped us anyway because it was the right thing to do. He paused. That is the same thing your husband did 22 years ago. It is the same quality of action done for the same reasons. He looked at her. I would like to keep being in contact with you after the legal process is finished and the park is built, and all the specific reasons we have been in each other's lives have been resolved. He paused, not because of those reasons, because I would like to keep being in contact. Ruth looked at the window. Outside Route 9 ran through Mill Haven in the Tuesday afternoon light, ordinary and continuous, the same road it had always been. She said, I think Frank would have opinions about that. Cole said, what are they? She thought about the man who had sat at the kitchen table with his graph paper journal and his reading glasses and his quiet way of saying things once and meaning them fully. She thought about the 45 minutes on Route 9 22 years ago and the gin rummy patient in the terrible joke that had been her favorite joke since she was 20 years old. She thought about what Frank had understood about the things that matter, and the people who understand that the things that matter are worth the time. She said, I think he would say that the people who understand that the work is the thing are the people worth staying in contact with. She paused, and that you should get that right shoulder imaged. I have been watching you favor it for months, and I want to know what I'm looking at. Cole looked at her. She said, make an appointment. Here. Tuesday is good for me after the 2 o'clock. He said, Tuesday works. She said, good. She stood up. She had a 2:15 scheduled. At the door, she stopped. She turned. She said the joke. He looked at her. She said a man walks into a library and asks for books about paranoia. The librarian whispers, they're right behind you. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then the expression that had been building somewhere in his face since October arrived at the surface all at once. And he laughed. A real laugh, brief and genuine, the laugh of a man caught completely off guard by the specific kind of joke that is so unremarkable and so perfectly itself that the only possible response is laughter. Ruth turned back to the exam room. She was smiling. She was still smiling when she went in to see her 2:15, a retired school teacher named Mabel Riggins, who came every 3 weeks and who had the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years in front of rooms full of children and could read a face the way most people read text. Mabel said, you're in a good mood. Ruth said, it's a good day. Mabel said, anything particular? Ruth sat across from her and opened the chart. She said, someone told me a joke that didn't work and it worked anyway. She paused. It's a long story. Mabel said, I have time. Ruth said, let's see about your blood work first. Then I'll tell you the joke. She told her the joke. Mabel did not laugh. Ruth told her it had been her late husband's favorite joke. Mabel said that explained everything and also nothing, which was exactly the right response. Ruth opened Mabel's chart and began. Outside Route 9 ran through Millhaven in the October afternoon light, ordinary and continuous. The creek moved south. The school bus made its afternoon run. The town went about its business, which was the entire point, which had always been the entire point. Ordinary mornings were what you were working toward when the nights were long. Ruth Calloway had learned this in emergency medicine and had relearned it in the years after Frank and had understood it now on this specific Tuesday in October in Millhaven, Ohio, in the specific, complete way that understanding settles when it has been fully earned. She worked. The afternoon moved forward. She was where she was supposed to be doing what needed doing. The matchbook was in the heater vent. The truck was in the parking lot. The road went forward. The East Ridge Trail opened on the first Saturday of the following October, exactly 1 year after the night on Route 9. The trail ran 2 miles from the South Lot Park to the viewpoint above the old Millbridge overpass, along the ridge road that had once been Briggs's private access and was now public land. The County Parks Department had put up a proper trailhead sign at the South Lot entrance, East Ridge Trail, Millhaven Land Trust, established 2024. Below the sign, a smaller notice, water quality monitoring, provided by the Millhaven Environmental Health Center. For current readings, visit the center's website. Ruth walked the trail the morning it opened. She walked it alone in the early morning before the public opening ceremony that was scheduled for 10 o'clock because she wanted one time through it. That was just hers and just the trail and just the October light before it became a shared thing. She walked up from the South Lot, past the playground and the picnic shelter, and the granite marker at the north end, and up the ridge road toward the viewpoint. The road had been resurfaced by the county in August, and the edges had been planted with a native wildflower mix that would fill in over the next 2 springs, the kind of planting that is an act of faith in the future, a thing you do knowing you will not see the full result for years. She walked for 40 minutes. The viewpoint was a cleared platform at the high point of the ridge, where the limestone shelf jutted out above the tree line with a sight line south across the full spread of Millhaven below. She could see the rooftops and the water tower and the elementary school and the creek corridor running south and west through the lower townships, the whole arrangement of the town spread out below her in the October morning light. She stood at the viewpoint for a long time. She thought about Frank. She thought about him specifically and without grief in the acute sense, in the way that grief becomes when it has had enough time and enough work done around it. It becomes a form of knowledge rather than a form of pain. She knew him. She carried what she knew. The knowing and the caring were hers, and they were good. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her hand found the journal which Patricia Holman had returned to her the previous month when the evidentiary process closed as promised. She took it out and held it in both hands in the October light, the hard cover and the graph paper pages, and Frank's name on the first page in his careful hand. She looked at the town below. She thought he would have liked this view. She thought he would have said that the data on the water quality monitoring was more interesting than the view, and then he would have looked at the view for a long time without saying anything else. She thought yes. She held the journal for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket over her heart, and she turned and walked back down the trail toward the south lot in the park, and the marker in the April light that said what it needed to say in the plainest possible language. He told the truth and he wrote it down. That was the whole of it. She walked down. Cole was at the south lot when she arrived, standing beside his Road King with 2 coffees, because Boone had been watching the trail the same as he always watched things that mattered, and had told Cole, and Cole had driven over and gotten 2 coffees from the diner on Main Street, which was what he did. She took the coffee. She said, "The trail is good." He said, "I know, I walked it yesterday." She said, "What did you think?" He said, "I thought Frank would have liked the view from the top and then would have spent more time looking at the water quality monitoring station than the view." Ruth looked at him. He said, "That is what you were thinking too." She said, "Yes, that is exactly what I was thinking." They stood with their coffees in the October morning at the South Lot Park in Millhaven, Ohio, with the granite marker nearby and the playground equipment and the new grass and the trees that had been planted along the perimeter. And that would be larger next year and larger the year after that, growing in the ordinary way of things that have been given good ground in the right conditions. The morning was good, the water was clean, the road went forward. Ruth Calloway drank her coffee. She had a clinic shift at 10.